everyone. I'm Jamie Monson. I'm the director of the African Studies Center here at Michigan State University. And it's a wonderful pleasure to have you all here today and to introduce my good friend and wonderful colleague, Rirhandu Mageza-Barthel. She's here from Goethe University in Frankfurt, where she's been a leader and an intellectual force behind their Africa-Asia project, which is called Africa's Asian Options, or AFRAZO. And I've had the pleasure of visiting AFRAZO myself, participating in some of their activities, and doing some partnering with AFRAZO. So we're really fortunate to have Rirhandu here. She's the first, we just realized, from AFRAZO to come here to Michigan State University. She's a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at Goethe University, and her specialization is the international relations of gender politics in the global South. She's written an important book on transnational gender politics in post-genocide Rwanda, published in 2015. And she's the co-editor of several volumes, including Negotiating Normativity, Post-Colonial Appropriations, Contestations, and Transformations in 2016, and a new volume, Afrasian Transformations, Transregional Perspectives on Development Cooperation, Social Mobility, and Cultural Change. So Dr. Mageza-Barthel is an expert on transnationalism, on the politics of gender, and also on China and Africa engagement, and brings all of those together in her research, as she'll be sharing with us today in her talk, Transregional Choices, African Voices, ? Perspectives on Africa's China Relations. Welcome, Rirhandu.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for hosting me over the past 2 days that I've been here. I think I've met a whole lot of amazing people and had some really beautiful conversations, and I'm really grateful for that. Something that I have been experiencing in the past couple of weeks that I've been in the US, and at the moment I'm located at Syracuse University, is that I've been attending some talks and some conferences, and there has been a practice that has struck me as a visiting scholar, where very openly, before people talk, they acknowledge the injustices that were perpetrated in the past, and that address the sites of universities and conventions as stolen land. And I realize that I fully don't understand the practice yet. I also realize that there's a scope and a contention around these practices that I need to grapple with, and I don't want to fold different kinds of struggles into each other. But what I would like to do is to follow suit as a form of solidarity. And I would wish that such recognition would also be openly acknowledged in other contexts, such as South Africa, where there are student and worker struggles that persist up to today as well. So what I will be talking about today it comes from a research program that began in 2013, as Jamie had spoken about, and that Jessica has also been privy to. And it's an interdisciplinary research program, right? And what I'd like to do today is reflect a bit on the process that we've had in the program and how I've gotten into looking at questions of gendering China and Africa and relations. And what we did is that we originally started off with about 40 colleagues in the social sciences and the humanities, broadly speaking. And we wanted to look at the relations between Asia and Africa with an interest of understanding further the agency that Africa, in its diversity and as a heterogeneous continent, has in interacting with Asia. Especially now that a lot of new Asian actors are on the continent, right? And this promised to be a challenge in itself, also because the program was designed as a comparative study, right? So different projects were engaging in different studies, and mostly either had 2 Asian countries they were looking at or 2 African countries they were looking at, and trying to look at the interactions with the other partner. And also because it was an invitation that we were following from the ministry to reform area studies in Germany and the way that it was being conducted. Can you hear me clearly? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Okay. Okay. So it was a challenging experiment or invitation that we kind of all took up and embarked on with our own backgrounds that we had, which were disciplinary, but which were also in area studies. But few of us actually had a background of straddling both continents and dealing with contexts from both sides and events from both sides. And something that has stayed with me whilst looking at this topic of gendered Chinese-African relations is a situation that actually happened outside of the program. And I'll get back to this in a minute. But I think I would like to do today, because of where my research is taking me and your own focuses that also include African history, is I'm hoping that I will be able to learn from the discussion today and also from the questions that you raise, right? So I'm really looking forward to the discussion and the engagement as we proceed. I think most of the time that we were talking and writing about gendering China-Africa in our project has mainly been dealing with coming to terms with something that we had not expected, right? I was undertaking this research project with Uta Ruppert, who's a chair for development studies at our university. And we'd begun that there was with an assumption that there would be avid collaboration between China and Africa in the sphere of gender politics, right? And among women's movements. And this because they'd interacted with each other previously, right? And also because there was a major new impulse at this time between Africa and China, and that the new problems that were being faced globally could be tackled together, right? That's the starting point that we had. And like at the top of our list were questions of development, right? So like I said, it was a comparative study, so we began looking at developments in Kenya and Ethiopia in terms of gender politics, and looking for the collaboration between the Kenyan and the Ethiopian women's movements with the Chinese one. And possibly also in terms of levels of analyses, we were looking at women's organizations primarily, right, that are organized, so it wasn't about individual women necessarily, although they also play a part, right? In terms of being a political force, or in terms of providing or taking hold of political opportunity structures, right? And what we also thought was important is that they would organize on behalf of women, right? So it's not just women doing political work, but they actually have an interest in doing work for women or identifying as some kind of feminist in some way, but that they were aware of the buzz, right, that the political and the economic relations were bringing about around them, and that they were probably also reacting to that or in conversation with other movements around them, right? So it was a fairly specified scope that we were looking at. But then it didn't take quite long that while speaking with colleagues abroad or in the different countries and undertaking initial explorative research, that we found that it wouldn't be as easy to study these relations as we thought it would be at the beginning, right? The relations look nothing like they do between Africa and Europe, right? They do things differently, if you want to put it that way. And they weren't necessarily taking place as autonomous, collaborative projects outside of, right, these European-African relations either, which would have been the hope on the other end, right? And so for a long time, in some way, we were concerned with this patchy relations that were going on, right, and trying to understand that, like this non-collaboration, you could call it in a certain way. And not just that we were seeing that, but also that we were hearing about that, right? So, so today, instead of going into that aspect of it, what I'd like to do is take seriously the assumptions we had at the beginning and go back into this question of collaboration. Also, to acknowledge, I think, some of the efforts that were taken in doing that. To understand the risks that the people who were collaborating were involved in, and also to acknowledge the energies that they put into collaborating, right? Because it doesn't seem to be the natural choice or the obvious possibility to engage in. So it's not about the frequency, like how often do they do it. It's not about how long do they do it. It's not about how dense are these relations, right? It's just really finding them and looking at how they play into wider politics. Okay. And I think by doing this, what I'm doing is I'm also returning to some of the main assumptions or tenets that you have in gender and women's studies, right? That once you include a gendered perspective, it not only brings women and men as people into these politics, but it also expands and it shifts the entire story that you're telling, right? If the theories of international politics and the histories of nation states have been built on the experiences of men, then there's something substantially lacking, right? And it's with such an assumption that you would be reinforcing certain political orders, right? That portrayed to be gender blind. So what I'll do today is I'll show that the narrative changes overall once you put gender politics into the China-Africa story. And the other thing that I will do is that I will show that gender in China-Africa is not a static process, right? But it's something that is actually a dynamic process itself. So there's a shift within the scholarship. Possibly, I think, where we also overlap in terms of interests, and I'm just going to try this in terms of an analogy, is that to me, the global is ever present in the local, right? That's like my theoretical approach. But so is the past and the present, right? And so it stands in relation to the here and the now. So if collaboration between Chinese and African women has been patchy in the more recent past, then it's my task to try and bring it in, right? And to weave it together. And this is, where I completely agree with what Jamie has recently written, and that will hopefully be published next year, is that we shouldn't treat history as a commodity to the real present story. And I'm putting real in inverted commas. Also because such kinds of conversations that we've had in political science have been around, for instance, discussions around mixed methods, right? Like how do you treat qualitative and quantitative methods in relation to each other, right? And because I use qualitative methods to do my research, I also ask what kind of explanatory value do you provide that, right? So that's just something in terms of methodology that I reflect on. But I think what it also shows is that I'm not a historian, right? I'm dabbling in history right now. And we'll probably not have the same techniques, right? And we'll probably also not share the same reading of the past or also look at the same kinds of texts. But I do have an interest in making knowledge production more equitable, right? And so that's, I think, why I'm going where I'm going with what I'm doing. So the challenge that we have when we look at collaboration is not to fall into this trap of accepting the governmental rhetoric, right, on China-Africa relations at face value, but it's really to look at it and to uncover the cracks and the crevices within it, right? That means that if they appear, making the tensions within these visible, and also to understand that very often these historical relations are used to justify the current ones, right? But what they don't do is that they don't, and this is on the sides of the governments and the governmental rhetoric, they don't elaborate what kinds of relations these actually are today, like what nature they have. And that's something that you can actually see in terms of how the movements have not collaborated with each other. But that is something that I'm not touching on today. So the way that I'm going to continue today is I'll be looking at generally gendering African-Chinese relations. Then I'm going to go into speaking about the South African experience and the liberation movements in South Africa in their relations with China, and conclude towards the end. Please let me know how I'm doing for time at any stage, just so that I'm aware of that. So I'm not sure, I always come back to this, especially also when I reflect about it, but it always comes back in a different way. I'm not sure if you recall this going through the Chinese in Africa, Africans in China network. And it's like a very vivid and lively network that Jamie and other people such as Yoon Young Park and a lot of scholars have contributed towards. But somebody actually threw this in and asked the question, is this gender? all right? And it's, just to give you a bit of background, it's an image by Michael Soy, who is an artist in Kenya. They came out as a series of images, actually. They came out in 2012 and 2013. And it's a satirical series called China Loves Africa, right? And obviously what you see is that it's a racialized and gendered depiction of women's and men's bodies. And what it did do, it kind of brought forth a conversation about the exploitation of Africa through China. And it brought about a conversation around, what it didn't do until I think we intervened was that it didn't bring in this question about this exploitation possibly being gendered or racialized or, building on difference in some way, right? So it was very critical, the conversation that happened, but it was not gendered. It didn't take difference into account. And this I'm trying to reflect on just in terms of how the discussions among scholars are going and how they're evolving. So this is, I think, something that art can do that scholars had not done at that point in time, and we had just started our program. So that systematic analysis, right, although there was an awareness around certain issues, wasn't quite present at that point in time yet. And I think a manner to show how the conversation has also changed since then, apart from looking at how people provide certain conversation material, is if we look at how the conferences have been organized since then, right? There have been conferences on Chinese and African relations, and within that, we now kind of have panels, or a panel, a section, that deals with gender issues. Although there had been something that dealt with, for instance, racial difference in Chinese-African relations. We also have, an active conversation that's starting to take place. I recently had a workshop in Johannesburg where I had feminists, or people in women's and gender studies, engaging with people from Chinese and African studies and talking to each other, because these are conversations that they would ordinarily not have, right? So they're like different ways organizationally and in terms of the discourse, how the fields are coming closer together. But this also builds a lot on the scholarship that exists at the moment, right? So apart from like these more formal or different ways, I was always very delighted to find a new article coming out once in a while that actually took gender issues into its into account. There's an article, for instance, and I'm going to try and categorize this as some kinds of waves of gendering Chinese-African relations. And it wouldn't be a surprise, I think, that the very first wave that came about dealt with the economic impact of Chinese products in African economies, right? So that's something that, for instance, if you look at work by Charity Manyeruke from Zimbabwe, looked at, but also Lynn Axelson and Nina Silvanus, who were looking at women traders in Togo and Ghana, right? And what they do, if you put them together, is that they kind of reflect these China in Africa debates, right? They raise questions such as how has China changed Africa, which potential is posed for Africa, is it a threat to Africa, what can China learn from Africa? So it's those kinds of questions, right? It's China going into Africa, if you want to put that as a wave. There's a second and a different kind of question that is raised by what I would call the China and Africa inquiries, right? And here the questions deal more on a conceptual and a theoretical level, right? So for instance, the late Lili Ling in 2013 had a response to a piece that Stephen Chan had written in a book that was reflecting on they call it the morality of China in Africa, right? But I don't know if the morality was really at the heart of it. But what she does is that she looks at the gaps and the omissions, right, that he produces in his telling of the China-Africa story. And so what she does is that she tries to insert women and a gender perspective into this history, right? The questions that kind of arise from this is when she does this, you kind of ask yourself, because it's dealing very much on a state level, right? And kind of, although it's an allegory and it's it's a tale, basically a Chinese tale that she's taking into account. But you kind of ask yourself when you hear that, what's happening underneath the state level, what's happening underneath the elite level, politically speaking, right? What does it mean in terms of representation? Is it the same thing because it's actually talking about colonialism in China? Is that the same thing between Africa and China, right? It raises certain kinds of questions about how do people organize politically in these kinds of relations. Is there something like autonomy, right? And what does it mean when you try and rewrite history in this way, right? So these are kinds of questions that this conceptual and theoretical work raises. And something that I would call the third wave is something that turns the first wave on its head, right? So you have Africans in Africa in China at the center of this work. For instance, Tu Hain in 2015 published a piece on African women in the workshop of the world, right, being Guangzhou, where she kind of shows their livelihood strategies within globalization as a framing condition. And Jamie's work, I would also put into this category, where she studies Tanzanian women in China as part of delegations during decolonization, right? And it raises questions such as, why do Africans go to China? What kind of opportunities do they suspect there? How do they get there? Which obstacles do they face? And what kinds of strategies have they developed against these obstacles, right? And I think if I were a visionary, which we're not trained to do in political science, but I think that there's a crest kind of coming up right now with a fourth wave, in that I was at a conference last week and I was on a panel on feminist and queer Afro-Asian, they called it perspectives. And it was really interesting because you have that explicit feminist voice and you also have that specific queer perspective into these relations, which again, would bring us back to these images where you ask yourself about questions of solidarity, of sexuality, of pleasure, of heteronormativity, right? And I can see that, or my hope would be that this is something that China African studies would pick up on as well, right? I think it's also not just because there's immense amount of critical scholarship out there, and even people explicitly, as I've been trying to show in these waves, gendering Chinese-African relations, but it's also in a certain way because few of the authors that I've kind of spoken about so far have explicitly called themselves feminist, right? So that's why I'm kind of hoping that this is going to be the next wave that we're going to be riding. Something that I think is also different is that from our perspective, when we say we're talking about gender politics, right, the politics of these gendered relations isn't at the heart of what they're doing, right? So although we learn a lot from them and really, see that this is becoming a field of scholarship within a field that is developing, it all happens under the ambit of politics, if you so will, right? It's not about the political relations per se, right, or about the political of it necessarily. And I know I'm putting everything into one pot in a certain way to systematize this, but this is something that I think is just part of what is happening at the moment. So I suppose after having given you like an overview of where this field was coming from, where it might be going to, it would be to place ourselves as researchers within it, right? And that's something that Uta Ruppert and myself have kind of had to do in conversation with each other, right? And we've kind of both had this background of coming from feminist international relations or development studies in the German system, and African studies, right? So those are like the two pillars that we build on. And what it does is that it allows us to kind of take politics on as a multi-level process, right? Instead of just being about the international or just about being the local. And it also allows us to kind of look at the social dynamics within politics, right? Which is why gender then becomes a defining feature of it. It is also a normative project. There is something that we're trying to do in doing this work, right? And that's something that I think we try and do by referring to or drawing on insights by post-colonial feminists who've very strongly critiqued how international politics has been either conducted or thought of, right? So one of the things that they do is that they throw in the questions of experience into this mix, so that geopolitics does not just stay geopolitics and global economy does not just stay as that, right? And that's something I think that people like Chandra Mohanty or Linda Carty have done also by looking at the structural nature, right, of where we currently are and bringing in activist conversations into that, right? Post-colonial feminists have also very strongly destabilized the assumption that all women are the same, right, and that they all have the same interests. And that alliance building around assumptions of being the same would be lacking, right? So even if we're looking at something within the global south, we still need to kind of look out for these differences that they have highlighted. Because if we don't, then you kind of further marginalize what's happening in the global south. So that's one of the things that we took on board. And what they also do by making the global more complex is that they kind of open spaces for appropriation, right? So that's like just the theoretical background about what kinds of feminisms we claim to be drawing on and what kinds of perspectives we hope to be representing. Other feminists have kind of not necessarily taken it from the theoretical level, but looked at or contributed towards theory by also looking at the way that women have organized internationally, right? And so there we kind of look at authors like Amrita Basu or Peggy Antrobus, who look at women's organizing from the global south internationally, and regard the 1980s and the 1990s as particular junctures of feminist organizing. And there, for instance, you can see things that, for instance, African women's organizations have always been involved in international politics, right? And that the way that they kind of interact with the Chinese one also relies on how they have kind of engaged with them at this level previously. They have been different, right? Because they have been shaped differently politically in their own contexts, which is critical to know. And this kind of also shows why many of them are politically oriented and also have a rights-based discourse, right? Because of what happened in previous decades. So what I think these junctures, which are articulated as UN conferences on African and on Chinese soil, right? There was a World Women's Conference in 1985 in Nairobi, which is the first time that the Chinese women's movement actually went to any of these global conferences. And there was the Beijing World Women's Conference 10 years later in 1995 as a follow-up process, was that there was this opportunity for common experiences of women from the global south to be brought together, right? And also for women from Africa and China to interact with each other. So collaboration between African and Chinese women's movements is completely difficult, right? To say the least, I think. Especially because neither of these conditions that were assumed or that have been spoken about intensively at these conferences, right? This question around sisterhood, this question that I was trying to raise about post-colonial feminisms, really applies in this context of Chinese-African cooperation, right? On the other hand, the question of friendship, which is something that kind of frames Chinese-African relations, doesn't really apply in terms of it always being portrayed in a way that is gender blind, although it's very gendered. So you can't kind of fit what's happening neatly into either of them, right? And I think the final thing probably is that they kind of look very similar on the surface, and that's something that makes it rather attractive, right? If you're coming from a European university and you kind of always have these discussions about, and I suppose it's also a discussion that we had, not just because we're in Europe, but where you have these discussions around political transformation and the differences between, or the defining lines between the state and civil society, right? Like, to which extent do they overlap? To which extent are they autonomous? Who controls who, and how does that work? Then it looks quite interesting if you look at China and Africa, because you can, on first appearance, assume, well, you know, they have a women's organization that will be, in certain terms, a quasi-NGO ministry type of a thing, right? Which is the All China Women's Federation and the actor that we're focusing on. Just as much as you have overlaps between civil society and the state in African countries, right? Owing to the transformation processes that have happened there. You have questions around struggles around autonomy from both sides, on both sides, right? From women's organizations or gender activists, if you'd like to call it that. And they've kind of had to face off against a very strong state, right? In terms of trying to also carve out spaces of autonomy and defining their own agenda and putting their issues onto the governmental agenda. And is, I think, a critical difference, if one thinks of these commonalities, would be the manner in which they're able to articulate this, right? Those kinds of priorities that they might have, and wanting to put those onto the governmental agenda is something that is rather controversial. And I think in a previous talk where we're looking at these non-collaborations and what we've been writing about, that's exactly what we're looking at, right? We're trying to understand what the position between women's movements is towards the narratives that the government is producing within Chinese-African relations. And what we do, and this is something that we've done the entire time, and this I think is also important because we can't do the work that people like Jamie, for instance, have done, is that we can engage with scholarship on Chinese-African relations on the Chinese side. We can try and understand the women's movement over there, if you want to put it that way, but we can't do both, right? So what we do is we look at the African side of it and how they engage Chinese-African relations. And I've been doing that more recently by looking at South Africa, which I think I've been doing not because I'm South African by origin, but because we think that the experiences that were taking place in South Africa were really important in terms of how the South African transformation process has taken place and how strong China has been as an actor. So we've had a big global actor, if you consider our program and how it's structured with different kinds of Asian countries, right? But then we also go to the level of low politics, which is where gender politics is normally classified within, right? So there's also a bit of balancing over there. And something that also makes it possible to look at South Africa and China in this way, I think, is also because the two countries, if you think about the World Women's Conferences that I mentioned earlier on, enter the transnational women's movement round about the same time, right? So there is a way with which this can be negotiated. I think that South African Asian relations have always been visible, and they've become more visible in the discussions that we've had around state capture more recently. BRICS has surfaced quite often at the moment in terms of the strategy that the former president has adopted to hold on to power, right? So that kind of was used as a rhetorical claim. And what we have in terms of gender politics, apart from just seeing and hearing about these transregional relations, is that we have a FOCAC Women's Forum. So the pictures on the left are basically the FOCAC depictions. So the Forum on Chinese-African Cooperation. There was a women's forum which took place in 2009, where women advocated for policies that would lead to increased representation and development, right? On the other hand, you also have female bureaucrats, right, within the different governments who kind of look at collaboration and try and interact with each other. At the moment, the FOCAC documents, apart from this last forum, the only women's forum that took place in this scope, kind of calls on gender politics and said in terms of strengthening people-to-people relations, and that is where they would kind of fold that into, right? But otherwise, there's nothing dedicated in this way. And this kind of doesn't quite strike you as much as how they refer to cultural relations or economic relations, right? There's like a difference in how this is recognized. The pictures that you have here on the side are the ones from the World Women's Conferences that I was talking about. And I think I would have to acknowledge as well where I got these pictures from, which I didn't do on the slide, but those are just that recollection that this is actually what happened. In South Africa, apart from the participation in these kinds of frameworks, what you also have is very strong party relations, right, at the moment, between the African National Congress and the Chinese Communist Party. And this also involves the ANC Women's League, right? So that's for the current period. What you don't have is relations between the All China Women's Federation and the Women's Ministry, the South African one, right? And that has, I think there are various reasons for this, including that they didn't quite match in terms of when this ministry was founded, which is quite late in the South African process, and also what they kind of hope to do together, right? So the articulation of the women of the ANC Women's League collaborating with the All Chinese Women's Federation or speaking to the All Chinese Women's Federation gets articulated in different sectors of South African governmental policy and not in the gender ministry. So although they collaborate, I think you can already get an understanding that it might be a bit patchy, right? And so it's kind of taken me on a different path, right? And this is to use new methods to confront exactly this patchiness, to explore what it would mean if there was collaboration, or what kinds of further collaboration that is, right? And that's where I kind of go back into history, back in time, to try and understand if it's always been that way and who's been participating. So what I did was go to the University of Fort Hare last year, which is an old South African university, which has immense liberation credentials, and which also has an archive that houses the liberation movement's documents to a great extent, or sufficiently so, that the South African liberation movements kind of donated to the university, right? What I hoped to do there is that I would find past interactions between parts of the country's liberation movements with China, because the party there claims that they've always kind of supported liberation movements, right, and liberation struggles across the continent. And I think, moreover, what kind of drove me in this direction is the knowledge that women's movements in Africa have always been, or have grown off of leftist movements, right? So there would have to be a logical conclusion to this, to say if liberation movements collaborated with China in an independence struggle, then you would also find women's interactions there. So South Africa, it's primarily the African National Congress that we know of. It's the Pan-African Congress, right? And the South African Communist Party in the resistance against apartheid that women were involved in. And they all have very strong transnational ties, right, along this idea of liberation movements. And I think it's because women organized and constantly mobilized within them, as other studies have shown, whilst fighting apartheid, that they kind of changed their own agenda of trying to institute a democratic and non-racist South Africa to becoming a democratic, non-racist, non-sexist South Africa, right? And I found something. So what I found was a photo album that was gifted to the the ANC headquarters in 2004 by a woman who was part of an ANC women's section delegation to China 20 years previously, so in 1984, 85. And there were 3 women in this delegation who kind of went on this trip. And it was a bit complicated to find it because it wasn't the archive was in this process of being digitalized. This wasn't part of that digital thing, so I kind of had the different finding aids within the archive were like really interesting to go through. And somehow it seemed like, you know, nobody actually knew that this album actually existed, and I kept on saying, no, but here it is, and can we please try and see if we can find it? And we actually finally found it. And what is inside, I mean, on the one hand, you can see that it looks like it's made in China. It's very obvious. But when you kind of go inside, you see 64 photos, and this is just information I get from the inscription, and I'm really, if anybody has interpretations around this, you know, please feel welcome to contribute. But they show a collection of places and events, right, where Manana Pekane, who's the lady who donated this album, together with her fellow comrades visited, right, during their journey. And according to what she had kind of just typed on the album cover inside, they visited Chinese women's groups, toured factories and schools in different provinces. They visited tourist locations such as the Great Wall, right, or Mao Zedong's residence, and they learned about women workers in China. Something that they also wrote is that they mobilized their counterparts on the anti-apartheid struggle and educated them on the ANC, right? So this is apparently what was taking place. I have a picture from a current visit of an Ethiopian women's delegation to China, and I think there's similar ones in a certain way from South Africa. Not necessarily the bottom one, but if you kind of compare, right, the then and now, it's this very similar framing, right, of what they were doing. It is, or they seem to be official photos in some way, and that is something that I think needs to be taken into account. And it is something, I suppose, that reflects the perspective of the All Chinese Women's Federation, right? So it's not a personal snapshot album. I think I'm going to skip that. I think what the photos do show in a certain way that it's not just about Chinese who come to Africa, but it's also about Africans who come to China, right? And that these are women activists, just as much as they are women activists who risked their lives to go there. Because if you're thinking this is 1985, right? These are women from the liberation struggle. And that they were also subjected to conditions of exile at that point in time. And it looks meager, you know, it's 3 women as a delegation, it's political elites, if you want to call it that, right, who engage in these relations. But it is meaningful. And I'm going to try and weave that into the into my understanding of it. What's not surprising, right, for feminists is that if you consider what I was saying about transnational history or transnational women's politics, right, that something like this could happen in 1985, right? This is a time when you have a very loud or present women's movement, right, where you have the Nairobi conference, where you have South African women's liberation movements who actually went to the Nairobi conference and interjected, right, especially from a Southern perspective, to not let women's issues be apolitical, right, which is a perspective that the North had tried to push at that point in time. But I think it does become a bit intriguing if you look at it from the side of China and Africa, right? The reason that I say this is because normally this album should not have existed, right, in the China-Africa context. If you think about that, there are government-set norms around who kind of interacts with whom, then it would be that South Africa only has relations with China officially, right, since the mid and late 1990s. That's the one thing. Because Pretoria, all the time along, has been interacting with Taiwan, right? The other thing is that there was a Sino-Soviet split, right, in terms of China-Africa. So those people who sided with the Soviet Union were not friends of China, right? And I think the third thing is that the Chinese government has very often supported the more radical elements within within Africa, sorry. And that would mean that you would actually have the Pan-African Congress, right, as a natural partner in this. The Pan-African Congress, I don't know how much you need to know about them, but they're basically the more radical faction within the South African liberation struggle. And they were highly effective at the beginning of the 1960s in mobilizing opposition to apartheid, but then were driven into exile, just like the rest of the leftist parties, and into underground structures. So I had to ask myself when I found this, that if the ANC Women's section was doing such kinds of things, right, did the PAC Women's Wing also do something similar? And what I didn't find is I didn't find a photo album. What I did find as proof that they were doing something with China at that point in time is a letter that was classified as taking place in May 1987 between the PAC Women's Wing and the All China Women's Federation. And so, like the album, it presents a voice from the African side, right, about these interactions and these engagements. It's also very rare to find something like this, on the one hand because of the way that the PAC apparently retrieved information and donated it to archives, right? There was a suspicion about the political transition process when they were returning to the country, so they didn't quite collate the information the same way that the ANC had, right, which has to do a lot with their own political stance, so that's how politics in a certain way plays into archives. And that's something that, like, one of the archivists was saying, that they still had a very strong struggle mentality, right, when they came back. The ANC was much more coordinated generally in how they were conducting politics, you know, to the extent that they actually also co-opted the internal opposition that had developed within the country in their absence. And they also kind of co-opted the struggle narrative, right? So it's not just the organizations, but also this, how do you think about the past? So let me quickly just show you the letters. So what you will find, so there's one letter, and I've taken out the names because very often they wouldn't actually even be accurate, right? And basically there's somebody from the headquarters in Dar es Salaam of the PAC Women's section who writes to a colleague and says, or it's going to the headquarters in Dar es Salaam, it's coming from Zimbabwe, where she basically says, okay, look, here's we've had 2 invitation letters, and we would like basically the All China Women's Federation to provide, following things. And among them, she kind of makes a request for material aid, right, towards that. So if you, for instance, see, where's Liz? She here? If you, for instance, see somebody saying, I want 1 combi, right, it's almost like us talking about traffic lights. So that's like a minivan. And there are certain things that they kind of request that are almost as symbolic or immaterial as what we find today. They justify this, however, by saying, and I think that's the more interesting part of it, and so here I'm departing from the normal way that I present because there is writing on the slides, but they justify it by saying, and I'm just going to try and summarize it a bit, by saying that they've always had excellent relations, right? So the women's section is kind of calling on the relations they've had with the main organization and China, right? Especially being based within Tanzania and around the world. The other thing that they say is that they have visited China occasionally, right? And this is the leadership, but also basically the people in their common struggle. So they call on this narrative, especially concerning the questions of revolution. The other thing that they kind of try to underscore is that there is a gender element to revolution, right? So they say that though our struggle is shouldered by both men and women, women have peculiar needs, right, that are akin to them as women within the organization. So they're making a very strong claim around this. And to address that, women have decided to set up projects that will benefit, that's at the bottom, women, right? And the entire organization. And they continue about the objective, which is to assist the PAC women to expand a small garment unit in Tanzania, which was already set up by United Nations agency, right? And that they would basically request assistance to be able to, conduct income generation, and to raise the funds that the PAC needs, but also to inculcate in women, and indeed the whole organization, a spirit of self-reliance. And what they what they conclude with is that the garment unit, if it's successful, could be expanded. So if the one in Tanzania, which they are really, sure is going to be successful, then they'd like to have another one in the frontline states, right? Which is basically where the liberation movement had settled along the borders of South Africa, in Southern Africa. Okay, so what do we see here? And I think I'm slowly coming towards the end of my talk. I think one thing that the PAC letter tells us is that it's from the locations in Tanzania and Zimbabwe that they were engaging the women's section, to coordinate and resist apartheid, and that they were engaging the Chinese Women's Federation. It's also important, I think, that if you think about the very first slide, the letter, that they were speaking about China and North Korea, right? So you're really getting like this peek behind the Iron Curtain on African soil, right? And I think that's something that also Jamie's work with the Tazara Railway has very strongly kind of shown us what it means to be in this anti-imperialist, anti-apartheid struggle in an infrastructure project that was built for this purpose. But if you compare the two, right, and not just take them as like on face value and together, it's because the ANC has much wider political relations, right, the photo album and the letters, that it acted probably or could act in a different way, in the way that we imagine what happened. You had people like Oliver Tambo, who were the chief diplomats of the party, right? You had much stronger relations within South Africa that the ANC harnessed across racial divides that the PAC didn't. In fact, it was actually going against these alliances, right, that it was founded. And these different parts of the Congress movement actually had their own relations, right, their own ties internationally. And there has never been any cooperation between the PAC and the ANC, apart from a very brief period, right? So there's always been this contest about who is the real representative of South African liberation movements. What both the letter and the album also do, though, is to kind of give us an idea how ideas of liberation, ideas of emancipation travel, right? So if you look at the wording of it, we are in 1985, more or less, with both documents, right? We are in a period where there are concepts such as women and development, right? Where there are concepts of empowerment. And that's the kind of conversation that they were having with each other. But I think much more importantly, what we see is that gender and women's politics can be done differently in that period if you look east, right? And that's the aspiration that people have today overall in the China-Africa narrative. And I think just finally to kind of conclude this contextualization of these two documents, 1985 and this period around it stands out because next to the general activism that you have in gender politics, you also have a really deteriorating and worsening situation in South Africa, right? So we were talking about this yesterday in a certain extent, but you have, compared to the 1950s and 1960s, but also compared to what happened after that, right, with the transition to democracy, a relatively dangerous time in South African politics, right? You have both the National Party government and the liberation movements upping their game because there was so much at stake at that point in time, especially because you had a lot of internal opposition, you had external opposition. The fight that they were trying to wage militarily could not be won in that manner, and so they had to kind of go into a negotiated settlement around democracy. You have the states of emergency at that point in time, right? You have curfews, civil laws being taken out of place, police brutality, and a lot that you kind of know about South Africa. And that's also where the frontline states come in, right? So that if they're trying to do those women's workshops there, that's because that's where also the destabilization campaign and the military action takes place. Generally speaking, if I take all of this into account, it would be quite easy to kind of see that it's not the first time, right, that we see a struggle for a better political and world order, where those who identify as third world women join hands, cutting across race, gender, and class lines to seek something that we called a better life for all, right, in the South African political discourse, or in the ANC slogan's promise for 1994. It could even be that the current China-Africa story is an extension, right, of the changes that we saw happening in 1985 or 1995, which is something that the letter and the album would kind of suggest. And how women experience this phase of global and local change is shown in the kinds of struggles they engage in, right? But also the kinds of alliances they were seeking at that point in time. And that's something that the All China Women's Federation makes us very aware of. And in this case, it would be that third world feminisms are paired with liberation struggles, right? So transregionalization as a choice for political actors gets a radical and critical edge alongside other strategies and alongside other solidarities. Right? I think it's knowing about and appreciating such gender politics that this narrative changes overall. So, because critically, Chinese African gender politics have taken place before the FOCAC process, which was one of the assumptions that we had. What I presented also suggests not just starting with FOCAC, but actually trying to periodize what's happening differently, right? So this is, I've tried to do this. I'm not sure if it's going to work, but I would assume that you have like the current period, which is a post-FOCAC period, where you have a neoliberal order that generates people who inscribe themselves into it in these relations, but also those who oppose it, right? The second period that I would identify would be this Nairobi-Beijing period, right? Where you have collaboration that follow the lines of the internal struggles as well as the external strategies of progressive movements, and where you also have a consolidation of women's movements in the global south. So if you think about it, normally you would start the story off by saying South Africa and China have had relations since the mid-1990s. So I'm kind of deplacing that as well. And possibly there might also be relations that have taken place prior to this, right? But probably after Bandung. So that's the other kind of period that I would identify. I think what these eras echo is that there's a dynamic process of gendering Chinese African scholarship that I alluded to in the beginning. Because the China in Africa scholarship, right, the China in Africa period reflects the post-FOCAC scholarship, right? And the China and Africa revolves around the women's decade in some way, if you're looking at the theoretical and the conceptual. Whereas the Africans in China scholarship takes a step further back, right, from the bulk of the evidence that we have to understand these experiences more widely. I think what you heard today is my voice and my perspective, right? Somebody else might find something else and read something else into it and do it differently. I'm very interested in this question about knowledge production, right? Especially under such kinds of conditions, where you have a lot happening in clandestine contexts, and information only now becoming available, right? That there is access to such information, that you have democracy, where you have this awareness about what you can actually look into. But it also ties into my previous work, right? Where I very often decided not to work on South African relations, because that kind of puts you in a certain position as a scholar. But my very first piece of writing that I did was in a project that is called Women Writing Africa, which is like an anthology of of primary sources. When I was still an undergrad student, I was invited to join this project, and they've done it across the entire continent, right? So there's a Southern African part, and there's a North African part, etc. And I think I'm coming back to these kinds of roots, right, of understanding, of trying to contribute towards an archive that otherwise did not exist, and bringing to light, in the spirit of women's studies also, stories that show what women have done, right, within gender politics, but within wider international relations as well. So going back to South Africa and going back in time is a conscious decision that I hope that I will be able to expand on further in future. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rirhandu, for sharing your work, some of your new questions, your new ideas. And so we have time now for questions from the audience. What we normally do is we pass the microphone. It's not a microphone for amplifying your voice, but rather just to be sure that your voice will be heard on the live stream. And Rirhandu has her own mic on her lapel. So if Shingi can pass the microphone, and then we can take questions. Yeah, Artura.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting. Well, my question is on this aspect. It's obvious that your presentation is focused in a period in which you're talking about mainly political relations and between women organizations in China, related to the official party, and some political movements in Africa. I don't know if you have studied or taken into consideration currently if this relation continues more in the field of social problems, human rights, or sexual political violence, because as you know that in South Africa is a real problem. I would like to know in which way Chinese organizations currently, if this is the case, support or give cooperation concerning this problem. Okay?
You can go ahead and answer that one.
Okay. So the interesting thing is, because I'm not working on the Chinese side of it, right? It does become a bit difficult to answer the question in the manner that you posed it. What I can try and do is I can try and show you something that is something that was one of the starting points that I had around the question of human rights, and I can also tell you about what some of the responses that I got in terms of the interviews that I led previously about the current relations. So here it is. Sorry, this always kind of helps to show it. I don't know if you know Zapiro. He's another cartoonist in South Africa who was part of, also the liberation struggle, but is always a very critical voice. And in 1995, when he spoke, and he's in all the daily newspapers, or the major newspapers, and what he kind of tried to pen in 1995, when South Africa was going to the World Women's Conference, was that there is a normative clash, right, between where this conference is being hosted and who's going there. So questions of human rights, if you look at the entrance right at the bottom, right, that's the bridge that they're supposed to cross to go to China. human rights is central to that. Questions of sexuality are also central to that, right? So you would assume not just because this album shouldn't have existed because of the Chinese-African relations that exist, but because of the understandings around human rights and how they had like imbued the liberation struggle or become part of that process of a new democratic South Africa, that there would be nothing that they can talk about, right? That there's a normative clash there. That's not quite the response that we got from participants, though. I think what we got from different people was either saying, you know, we look at other South-South relations, so we don't just look east, we look at, for instance, the World Social Forum and other places, because we have a similar understanding of social justice, right? Or they say, well, and you'll see this quite often, let's try and have a conversation. That's what I was saying, it's not about longevity of these relations. Let's try and have a conversation, let's have a workshop, right? For instance, through Fahamu or different places. And let's see what we have in common. And then these relations don't persist because they notice that these conversations aren't easy to hold, right? It's also a question of where these conversations take place, right? So do they happen within African countries? And who's able to travel towards Africa to do that, right? So who can you have these conversations with? And so I think it's just critically important to remember that the special status that the All China Women's Federation has, without discarding, though, that there is a tension that has been there historically on their side too, right? So.
So I'll ask a question. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering, because some of my work focuses on popular expressions of things, I was wondering in the contemporary period, and I could be wrong about this because I don't really work with China, but just from my observations of the continent, it seems that the sort of Chinese, the advent of the Chinese that's kind of been on the up and up in recent years is mainly Chinese men coming to the continent, right? I don't know if I'm accurate about that, but it seems like in a lot of the spaces, it's Chinese men in these spaces, which I think lends its hand to an understanding, since that's what we're dealing with, to maybe more interaction and understanding with the men.
Right.
To what extent? So the first part is that an accurate sort of assessment of who's coming to Africa from China, and to what extent does that pose an obstacle for this sort of feminist and woman to woman engagement between Africans and Chinese ones?
That's really interesting. I think it's interesting because, like I tried to allude to, I don't do quantitative work, right? Even then, I mean, like, how would I even map that, right? But maybe it should be done. Maybe, I think what it does do, it brings up complex questions around gender roles and spaces and things like that, right? So this question around distribution of labor, right? If in many ways transnational migration is linked to labor relations, right? Then it's that questions around entrepreneurship and unofficial type of markets. Questions around official representations within embassies and all of those kinds of institutions, right? That would play into that as well. It would only be anecdotal if I said, well, I went to the embassy in Pretoria and the press speaker was a woman or something. That's it kind of makes it really interesting when you then ask her or them, so what do you do on Women's Day, because you're in South Africa in August, right, which is a traditional Women's Day, and they're like, oh, we haven't done anything yet, But then you speak to another woman and she kind of says, well, we donate, these are like Chinese women's organizations on the ground, South African Chinese women's organizations, and they say, well, we donate things to certain charities in need and hospitals and things like that. So just being a woman is, is not enough, to put it that way. You need to kind of want to do certain things or see opportunities in these interactions in some way. So that's the extent to which there's a challenge, right? And we'll have to see, I think, in terms of some people were invested in a particular governmental project, right? I think President Zuma quite strong. If you think about the different presidencies that we've had and which kinds of projects they've tried to foster, right? You have the whole question around the African Renaissance being the Mbeki project, right? You have the whole question around the human rights being the Mandela project. You have the Zuma period where the Chinese-African relations were very, very strong. So now the question is what happens in the Ramaphosa period, right? Let's see.
My questions are related to both the two previous questions. One, that first slide that you presented, was that America peeking into that relationship with Africa and China? And my second question is, when you think about especially the 80s in South Africa, I think about organizations, I think about NGOs. I think about NGOs playing a very strong role in the anti-apartheid movement, and just various different NGOs from women groups and what have you. It sounds like your conversation is on a plane of governmental relations and relationships. Is there evidence or a particular plane when we have a discussion that's a little bit lower on the ground when we talk about NGOs and women from both countries in that kind of fashion?
In that period?
In that period and carrying on to the present. I know that NGOs, in many ways, after the 90s and in 94, many NGOs kind of went to the wayside in South Africa. But just in general, were there any connection or interaction between China and Black South African women in that time period?
I mean, I think it's one of those questions of how, I'm going to start with the latter question. How would that be possible, right? Just in terms of, from both sides, getting a passport wasn't really an easy enterprise in South Africa at that point in time. It was possible. It wasn't something that was exceptional, but that's one thing, right? So I'm like, most of the people who skipped the border didn't do it with a passport, just to put it that way. People from China coming, like people from mainland China, women's or gender activists coming from mainland China to South Africa at that point in time. What you do have, which is I think really interesting when you look at, and I'm kind of going back to the work that Yun Young Park has done with Tu Hain and stuff, what you do have is you have different cohorts of South African Chinese, right, which is something particular to South Africa, that you have like different generations because they've had such long relations. And amongst that, you will find people who are actually South African citizens, right, of Chinese background. You will find people who have a Taiwanese background, and you'll find people who are from the more current wave of migration to South Africa.
Is that Chinese community in South Africa, the current Chinese community in South Africa, is that post-1994?
So this is how it's composed now, right? You can like look back and look at these different cohorts and kind of say, okay, those Chinese who are, let me say, from the first cohort, have certain experiences of apartheid as being disadvantaged as well, right? And trying to mobilize against that. Those people from, for instance, the Taiwanese cohort might have enjoyed a different kind of privilege because of the governmental relations that were there. Whereas those people who come in the current period have no experience of apartheid at all, right? But all of these cohorts have organizations, and they all have women's sections within them, right? Yeah. And they mostly do cultural politics. That's what would combine them. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rirhandu. I just have a couple of comments and then a question, more a clarifying one. So I'm thinking about the 1980s and the ways that all throughout the decolonization era, China was actively inviting representatives from political parties coming to China, engaging in that party-to-party kind of diplomacy, even, and gender played a big part in that. You know, people like I've written about Bibi Titi Muhammad as a party leader, and the Chinese very much understood the politics of gender in terms of nationalist mobilization around the continent. And what's interesting then about the 1980s is that I'm wondering if by 1985, it's clear to China that putting all your eggs in the PAC basket may not give you what you need after after perhaps what's to come next. I don't think in 85 people knew what was coming next, but we saw that recently with South Sudan, where China was smart about engaging different political parties, where the rest of the world like, oh, we're on this side, you know, we're on that side, and then China's kind of willing to jump in and make connections there. So that might give you another way to think about that. But I agree, that's fascinating that that's happening at that particular moment. And what also just, sorry, these are things that are close to what I work on, but you know, the third space of Tanzania is critical. So even though you couldn't get a passport to go here or there, Tanzania, Cairo, Pakistan, you know, people who flew to China under clandestine conditions could get there through Pakistan. So I think investigating, you know, by 1985, there's still spaces where a third safe space for liberation is still kind of available. That's very interesting too. And then how does gender, what's going on with gender and what's going on with gender solidarities in those third spaces? That could be something you could look into as well. And then just my one question, Rirhandu, I was just, could you say more about what you mean by patchy? Like, are you saying that all the indicators for South-South solidarity were there and you expected to see it, but it was there? But are you just saying it was weak or it was fragile? Or could you just say more about what wasn't there that you expected to see? Because I wasn't quite sure what you meant by patchy.
Right. I'm going to start with the only question, I suppose, because I find
Sorry, that's just something I care about, so I wanted to give you a couple of thoughts.
Absolutely. And I let me put it this way. I really think this question about the third space is interesting. I'm going to take that on board to reflect about that more. And also this question around that they possibly realized by 1985 that it wasn't so good to put all eggs in one basket. I'd said at the beginning that we started off with a comparative study, and that's something that when you look at Kenyan history, something similar is going on there as well, just in terms of who are they siding with, KANU, or you know, or which factions within KANU, and you know what's going on there. So I think that's also just important, because I think in Kenyan politics, you know, it's very opaque as well how it's going and who's winning, and you know, although you have that constant change, put it that way, and those constant conflicts within the political elites. So that was really interesting to reflect on. By patchy, we had originally assumed that we could actually go to Kenya, to Ethiopia, somewhere, find some space, like there, where women are actually collaborating on almost something like what they wanted to do in the letter, right? But that we would basically find, maybe I'll put it in German terms, maybe something like a GIZ house, or some kind of a common project where you can actually go in and look at what's happening and what they're discussing, what they're debating. And that's something that would be possibly, and this is maybe where we need to kind of also reflect on our own assumptions, but I mean, that's very often how politics in the non-governmental sphere takes place, right? In development politics as well. But also to be critical with ourselves and thinking about how things are done differently, right? That it's this question of delegation exchange that is so much at the forefront instead of having a physical presence, right? Which is where I think also this question around what kind of assistance, and that's something that you gave a clue to a long time ago, right? What kind of assistance is being provided? Because I did not understand when I saw the donation that the All China Women's Federation did to the African Union's Commission, right? On the one hand, they provided like a turnkey project as the African Union headquarters, right? And on the other hand, they were donating at the same time, more or less, sewing machines worth $76,000, right? And medical aid delivery kits or something. Basically for all women in rural areas in Africa, right? And that just didn't make, the dimensions between these two things didn't make sense to me at all. So when you spoke in Frankfurt, I kind of started to get an idea that this is not just a tradition, but it's just so different, right? And there's a different way that we need to look at this. So it's patchy in that way. It's patchy in the way that it's not, you will have like haphazard relation. You know, it doesn't take place constantly across time. You will find specific times, periods, issues, junctures where these relations take place. And they're not always pro, you know, so even if they do, like even if people take a position on, that could also be opposition to, right? So to, you had asked about the NGOization of South African politics. And COSATU, for instance, at some stage, like made a big brouhaha around, you know, Chinese textiles taking up the market, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, they're in the governmental alliance, right? So they are also basically collaborating on that level. Or they also have investment arms that are intertwined with it. So it becomes complicated. And I think that's what this patchiness is supposed to represent in a certain way. I think also originally when I started to use the word, when I was trying to put my notes together for today, I was also thinking around the US context in which I'm in and how, you know, just this idea, even if it's not necessarily accurate, but how you kind of have a quilt that you're putting together in a certain way, you know, those ideas of emancipation and liberation of stories or histories that kind of go through.
Well, thank you so much, Rirhandu, for very provocative, lots to look at. I'm glad to see you moving into the field of history. So want to let everybody know next week we won't have an Eye on Africa. I hope everybody will be having a lovely holiday. But the following week on December 6th, we have one of the presidential fellows from the African Studies Association is coming here to Michigan State University. A really great opportunity. He's a professor from the Department of Literature at McCurry University, James Ochita, I'm thinking it's Ochita. And his topic is Diaspora Identity, the Unhomely, and the Politics of Belonging in Indian East African Novels. So another talk that's going to be bridging Africa and Asia. And he is in the Department of Literature at McCurry, but he got his PhD from Stellenbosch University. So there's another link there. He has an MFA. He's a published author. So those of you, looking at Shingi, who are interested in literature, he writes also about post-colonial theory, Indian Ocean diaspora, African diaspora, Caribbean literatures, popular culture, and more. So very highly recommend that on December 6th. I also want to remind everyone that Justice Albie Sachs from South Africa will be teaching a course in the law school during 3 weeks in January. There are still some openings in this course for graduate students who are not in the law school or honors students, undergraduate honors students. So please spread the word. It's a really great opportunity, and not everyone may have learned that. It's not a big time commitment. It's three Fridays and one Thursday. Also reminding everyone that the Eye on Africa on January 17th will be Albie Sachs. It's going to be kind of the public class in his series on the theme same-sex marriage in the Constitutional Court of South Africa and the U.S. Supreme Court. So big topics for everyone. Also reminding everyone that this evening from 4 to 6 upstairs we have one of our tea times. Today it'll be Angola, Cameroon, and Somalia for the African Tea Time. And last, don't forget, folks, this weekend, the Africa Gala. We are the world, 5 to 8 p.m. at Everett High School Auditorium. If you need more information, come down to the African Studies Center. It's going to be a great celebration of Africa right here, organized by our African students. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Rirhandu. We're so delighted to have you. And have a great Thanksgiving, everybody.
Thank you.